So this is our summer syntax celebration, welcoming you all. Here I am in Connecticut, and I'm looking forward to spending the next 4 mornings with you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and Literacy How, and then I want to find out a little bit about you. Literacy How is a nonprofit organization. We work with teachers primarily in the state of Connecticut, but we also have contracts with districts in other states as well. And essentially what we do is we build teachers' knowledge about the science of reading. We do not subscribe to one program because we don't believe there is a perfect program that gets the job done across all domains of language and literacy. But we certainly believe in the research and evidence behind best practices. We have a team of about 10 people. We call ourselves mentors, and we actually provide embedded professional development for teachers. Because truth be told, the transfer from the science and research to practice takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of support. And we have found that coaching teachers in their classrooms with their own students, with their students' data, is the most effective way to see transfer for any of the practices. So I'm a special ed teacher by training. That's my background. I worked with kids for 25 years, taking off my teacher hat and putting on my professional development hat in 2000. So I've been doing this work with schools and districts for 25 years. I have an amazing team, as I said, and I'm just very passionate and mission driven in this work because we have so many children who struggle with reading for a variety of reasons, which I'll talk more about. So this reading wheel has been sort of a graphic organizer, if you will, for all the content that we teach our teachers. And I'm going to talk specifically today in the next 3 days about oral language. Obviously, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about syntax, but I'm also going to speak about comprehension and writing on day 3. We'll talk more about writing tomorrow, a lot more about comprehension. And vocabulary will come into play a little bit too, as you'll see in a moment. But this is our reading wheel. This is our website. And can you see the website, Claudine? I can see you. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see the website? Excellent. So this is our website. And on the website, you'll see that there's a place to go for the model for success, which takes you to our reading wheel. And the reading wheel has a lot of information about the reading wheel. And you can click on these different links and it will provide you with, so let's look at syntax specifically, frequently asked questions, and then a lot of other information, tips for teaching, articles that we think are really worth you looking at here. Some of them are linked directly for you, etc. And then we have 4 Literacy How Professional Literacy Series books, and a lot of what you're going to see today, including activities that I'm going to give you access to, come directly from this book. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is that we do have a YouTube channel, and you're going to see some videos from our YouTube channel. But just so you know, if you wanted to look at other domains, we have playlists for oral language, for phonemic awareness, phonics, spelling, syntax, vocabulary, and then some of our favorites are over here. Okay, so I just wanted to call your attention to those resources. Now, can you see my reading wheel again, Claudine? Excellent. Thank you very much. All right, so that's a little bit about our content, and you're going to hear more about that, obviously, as we go along. So syntax is truly one of those domains that I have found in the 25 years that I've been doing this work is overlooked, misunderstood, And something that I feel very strongly about that we need to spend more time explicitly teaching our teachers as well as our students. So this is something that we're going to obviously talk a lot about today. In the 4 days that lie ahead, we're going to talk about syntax and syntactic awareness, what the role of words, how they function in sentences. We're going to talk about what does explicit instruction look like for students, whether they're pre-K, 3rd grade, 7th grade, 9th grade. What does that look like to support reading fluency and comprehension? We're going to spend time tomorrow talking about the importance of analyzing our texts, specifically looking at sentences and how we can prepare them for explicit instruction. And throughout the 4 days, I'm going to share strategies that will help students develop not just their reading comprehension, but their written expression. And really what I want to keep driving home with you all is the importance of a multi-componential approach, which means that syntax is never just syntax, it's syntax and we can incorporate syntax instruction throughout the day while we're thinking about phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, all those domains. We're not going to silo our instruction. We're going to think about how we can build a really nice integrated model for instruction. So our 4th day is going to talk more about that aspect of lesson planning and what might that look like. When I give you access to a handout folder, you're going to see a few articles, and this one is one of my absolute favorites by Cheryl Scott. It's an article that appeared in Perspectives, which is the IDA journal, a number of years ago, but it still stands true today. And I love this quote that Cheryl says, "I see syntax as the vehicle, even the workhorse, right, of meaning. It's also a vehicle, not the only one, but certainly a major one for acquiring our knowledge base that's needed for reading comprehension. And if that vehicle is flawed, it will not transport knowledge very well." I'm sure many of you have heard of Natalie Wexler. Natalie Wexler is on a big bandwagon to ensure that our students build their background knowledge, and I couldn't agree more. However, without syntax and syntactic awareness, that background knowledge is not going to go as far as it must. A couple of guiding questions that I'm going to address, and I've already mentioned this one. We're going to talk about how does a student develop syntactic awareness? Some children already have it. They just have it. It's like phonemic awareness, right? They have it. You don't have to teach those students phonemic awareness, or in this case, syntactic awareness, because they are already steeped in it. But for those who aren't, we must explicitly support them. And how we might do that is through coaching, right? So even if you're a Gen Ed teacher, you can coach your peers as you learn more about this. You can share what you know with them and share resources so that they understand the importance of syntax. Over the next 4 days, we're going to cover this outline. So today we're going to really go into the background on syntax and syntactic awareness. For those of you who said you're moderately familiar, you're going to deepen your knowledge of both. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about text analysis and how that's going to support your reading comp. So I hope everybody brought a book. For sure, you're going to need it tomorrow. And on day 3, on Wednesday, I'm going to specifically shift and talk about writing, because a lot of syntax instruction occurs as we teach writing skills, right? But I'm going to really share some of the resources and information that I've found to be most helpful in this regard. And on day 4, we're going to talk about lesson planning. So hopefully by the end of these 4 days, you walk away with some tools where you can figure out where and how you can fit this information in this explicit instruction. And just a little bit of context. We know terminology matters and it can trip us up, right? So I want you to take a moment and just figure out what definition applies best for the word syntax? So is it 1, 2, 3, or 4? Grammar and semantics. And I'll give you a hint. One of these actually has 2 definitions. So I'll just give you a moment to think about this. So we define syntax as the arrangement of words and phrases. Semantics is really the study of words and phrases and meanings and their relationships. And then grammar is often thought of as the language's system and structure. But the one that we really want to think most about is number 4. That's what we usually think about when we think about grammar. It's the rules for how parts of speech are used to create sentences. But the term that I really like to use most frequently is syntax, right? That's the one that I want you to think more about. What is syntax? And that's what you're going to hear about today and the rest of the days that we're together. We use the language of syntax to facilitate better writing and reading. Now, I'm sure most of you have seen Hollis Scarborough's rope. Is that true? See some heads nodding? Yep, thank you, Claudine. Pretty pervasively used, right? Graphic organizer. And I'm sure that if you know the rope, you've also seen and heard about the simple view of reading, decoding times listening, or language comprehension equals reading comprehension. So here I've put the D for word recognition, the LC for language comprehension, and the RC when we multiply, right, and think about the integration of language comprehension and word recognition or decoding skills. And here at the top of the rope, we have language structures. And Hollis always acknowledged that language structures include syntax and semantics, right? So when we think about language structures and we think about these 2 domains or aspects of language, we think about sentence structure that includes punctuation. We think about the use of words, phrases, and clauses, as I said before, right? Coherence within and between sentences. So it's not just one sentence at a time. What we have to do is link the sentences. That's where often inferencing happens. And then this idea of semantics, which includes idioms, figures of speech, multiple meaning words, etc. Now, how familiar, could you put in the chat box, how familiar, just say yes or no if you're familiar with a 4 processing model. Yes or no? Thank you, thank you. So I've got a variety, yes and no, a bit, thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so since many of you aren't familiar with this model, I'm going to take a moment to explain it to you. We think about processing language when we're reading, right? Whether we're listening to language or reading it, right? We're processing it. But in this case, we think about what the reader has to do to process words. And it's never just words in isolation. But if you look at the first layer here, the first step is to look at the letters, right? So we see B-O-W. And now we have to look at that word B-O-W and think about what is the pronunciation of that word. Now, I chose B-O-W because we could say bow or we could say bow. So we activate meaning immediately. When we see a word, it immediately activates what the word means. But in this case, it's tricky because we can bow, right? We have a bow of a boat, or we have a bow on a package, a bow and arrow, or the bow that we use to play a violin. And I don't know which bow or bow it is until I hear the sentence, right? I have to hear a sentence or know the sentence to understand the context. And as it says here, contextual analysis can be used to verify the accuracy and fit of the word in the sentence, right? It should not be relied upon to identify the word, which is what happens a lot of times in 3 cueing, where children are encouraged to look at pictures to activate meaning, and then they take their eye off the word. So it's an important reminder, and that's why the 4-part processor, which was developed by Mark Seidenberg and McClellan, is a really important way of thinking about how complicated reading is and how we have these processors that each have their role to fill in reading. So now I can look at, I still have to think about bow and bow, because bow has a couple different meanings, as does bow. In fact, in English, we have many multiple meaning words, right? We're going to come back to this, but this is where syntax and semantics are joined at the hip, right? They're inextricably linked. I have to know, for example, the duck that is the web-footed water bird versus duck through the doorways, which is a verb, versus an idiom to have a natural talent for something. I took to it like a duck to water. There's so many examples of this in English. So again, reiterating the importance of meaning and the context of the sentence. So here I go back to the context and I see the blank scraped the dock, right? So I now know it's the bow that scraped the dock, but I still have to have background knowledge of what the bow of a boat is, because not all students would necessarily know that. They will probably know take a bow, but they don't know about the bow. So again, this whole idea of processing language at the grapheme level, mapping it onto the phoneme. So I hear the word bow. Now I know it's B-O-W. I have a meaning, but I still have to have the sentence for context. So again, syntax is extremely important in this process. Now I want you to take a moment and read this sentence. It's just one sentence. It comes from this wonderful book, A Place to Land, about Martin Luther King's speech that inspired the nation, that we all are very familiar with. And I want you to take a moment to read it and tell me what about this sentence would be complex. What about this sentence would be difficult for students to comprehend? And if you could just pop something into the chat on that front, I would like to read what you have to say. All right, thank you so much. Excellent, excellent. So there are a lot of things about this, not just syntax, but of course that's part of it. Many of you mentioned the dependent clauses. You mentioned embedded information, right? The embedded clauses. Background knowledge is important. There's also inferencing that's required. Vocabulary is a problem, right? And when we think about syntax, we also have to think about punctuation. And as you mentioned, here's the hyphen, how does that fit in? And the commas, etc. So thank you for sharing all of that with me. We're going to come back to this sentence in a moment, but you can see sometimes it's one simple sentence that we have to unpack and think about for the students in front of us. What will make these texts challenging for them? In an article that Tim Shanahan and Doug Fisher and Nancy Frey wrote in 2016, they talk about the challenge of challenging text, of complex text. Whoops. And I have to move things around on my screen to see things, so pardon me. And this idea that if students are to interpret this meaning of these complex sentence structures, they have to know how to make sense of the convention of text, the phrasing, the word order, the punctuation language, all the things that you just pointed out when you reacted to that sentence. So what is the role of syntax in reading? Well, comprehension is influenced by syntactic knowledge without a doubt, and lots of researchers have stated that. And why is it important to teach syntax? Well, interestingly enough, as I mentioned at the beginning of this session, there's not a lot of explicit instruction happening in syntax. And just as true as in text composition, it receives little attention. And that was pointed out by Louise Spear-Swirling in an IDA brief that she wrote about structured literacy. I'm sure that many of you have not seen this. It's an excellent, excellent infographic that IDA recently revealed and released is really the word I was looking for. And what I want you to look at specifically is the what, but the way this is organized is we think about who is structured literacy for. It's for all students in all tiers. The what of structured literacy, which I'm going to talk more about in a second, are the elements, right? The domains of language and reading and writing. The how is how we teach, the pedagogical principles that are near and dear to our hearts, those of us who believe in the importance of how we teach students to understand and the principles of teaching and learning. Those I will not go into over the next 4 days per se. I may reference them here and there. And then at the bottom of this infographic is this idea of the science of reading, or why. We all know that there's a preponderance of evidence for how to teach the structure of language and structured literacy, and yet a lot of that information doesn't get into teachers' hands. So if you look at this section of the infographic, this is the what of structured literacy, and I like the way this infographic divides the content into word recognition / including handwriting and spelling, and comprehension, including composition, because Hollis Scarborough's rope is awesome, but it doesn't include writing. And then, as I said, we'll do more of that on day 3. But here on this right side under comprehension, we have sentence structure and grammar. And then at the bottom, this idea of integrated language, reading and writing instruction to support automaticity, fluency, and reading proficiency. I shared with all of you, I hope anyway, an article that Nancy Eberhardt wrote in 2013 for Perspectives, and it's a goodie, and I'm going to reference it over the next few days. But one of the things I wanted to call your attention to, sort of the how we teach, are these ideas of effective instructional practices, including these 5. So each of these I will reference, and I'm going to start by talking about what do we mean by explicit instruction in syntax. Before I do that, I want you to think about this sentence and say it to yourself as I show you the parts of this sentence. Okay, so I parsed that for you so that you could read it in grammatical entities to make sense of that sentence. And question for you, is this in subject, verb, object order, or is it in non-canonical order, which would be object, verb, subject? If you want to pop that into the chat, you can do that. Okay, so you all are pretty savvy. You know that subject, verb, object. It's an easier type of structure. What about the type of sentence? Is this a compound or a complex sentence? You can pop that in too. Okay, you guys are awesome. It is a compound because it has the fanboy so there. Excellent. So when we're going to start teaching our students about sentences, we're going to teach them about parts of speech. I like to call them the building blocks of sentences. Here they all are. And I'm going to teach each one in turn. The one I will not talk much about is the wow from the sentence that you just saw, those interjections. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those, really going to spend most of our time talking about the other 7. And again, use your chat for a moment and tell me what you would want your students to know, depending on the age. What do you teach them? What is a sentence? What's the definition you would want them to use? And don't look at your handout yet. I want you to tell me what you think a sentence, what they should know. Those terms are hard for some students. Expressing thoughts and words. Okay. Anybody else want to chime in? Has a who and a do? Thank you, Megan. Nice. Okay. I'm going to go back one. Somebody asked me to show this one again. These are the building blocks. I don't know if you wanted to see this as well. The sentence. Okay. So let's go back to this question. What's a sentence? Some will say it's a complete thought. And I saw that on some of your responses. It's a complete thought. The problem with that is that's a hard concept, right? That's an abstract concept. It could work for older students, but for some, what does that mean? It's complete is a word that's kind of tricky. Thought is very abstract. So but it's often used. Some of you also said it makes sense, but similarly, that one is a little abstract too. What does it mean to make sense? I talk about my dog, my energetic, fluffy, loving, wonderful dog. And that makes sense. I'm going to give you an idea about my dog, but it's not a complete thought. It's not a sentence because it's missing the action, right? It's missing a verb. Okay. It has a capital letter and a period, and that's something that many students will tell you. If you ask, especially a little kid, what's a sentence? They tell you that. And that's because it's been drilled into them. They need to know that. And that is a very important aspect of writing sentences. However, it doesn't help with the concept of what is a sentence, right? So, is this a sentence, I would ask? And we know that the answer is no, it isn't, right? Because it's missing something. I have some nouns and namers here, but I don't know who played all morning. Right, exactly, Teresa. Who did it? It's missing the subject, precisely. Is this a sentence? Yes, it's imperative, exactly. So even though it doesn't have the subject, the who, it's implied. And that's certainly an important concept to teach our students. So that's another matter for another day, but you all are great. Thank you for responding to my questions. I got to keep you awake. If you didn't get your fix of coffee, we'll keep working on that. All right, so here's how I like to talk about sentences. And again, this depends on your students and what grade and age level they are. But I'm going to start, especially for little kids, with the who and the do. Very concrete. Who, somebody or something's doing something, right? So I'm going to refer to this noun or subject for little kids as a namer, because as you're going to see, I want kids to understand the role that these building blocks play in sentences. That's the most important thing. And verbs are often action words, not always. We have linking verbs that can be problematic too, but the who and the do kind of gets the job done for the most part, right? So I'm going to talk about, again, for you, not for the kids. Eventually, we'll get this concept across. What is a simple subject? What is a compound subject? What is a complete subject, right? It has the dog and cat who live next door, right? That's your complete subject. Then we have our simple predicate, our compound predicate, and our complete predicate that comes with the modifiers. More information about the noun, or the namer, or the verb, or the action word. So as far as this explicit instruction is concerned, we also want to teach the idea of a clause, right? And a clause, and again, this isn't necessarily the lingo that you're going to use for K and 1, but as students get older, they're going to need to understand the concept of a clause. It's a group of words that work together, right, in a sentence that have the subject and the predicate, or the who and the do. And we want to teach them pretty quickly that a sentence has to have at least one clause, right? It's and it has to have a subject and a predicate, or a who, would, and do. Now, notice that when I'm teaching these terms, again, depending on my kids, if I'm doing a sorting task, which you're going to see in a little while, I might have the terms, all these terms on my pocket chart, right? So that eventually they understand that they're the same thing. We could call it a who, we could call it a namer, we can call it a noun, or if it's the subject of the sentence, right, the who is doing the action, then we're going to eventually call it a subject. But I agree that those terms can be tricky for kids. So we're going to teach the concept of a clause, and it could be 2 words, something super simple. One word representing the who and the other word representing the do. Now, since I asked you to bring a text today, I would like you to take a moment and find a simple sentence in your text, right? And write it down, and then underline the simple subject, underline the simple predicate, circle the complete subject, circle the complete predicate, and then tell me if there is a compound subject and or a compound predicate. So I'm hoping that you'll come up with a variety of sentences. I'm going to stop sharing, except no, I'm not, because you need to see the directions. But I am going to stop sharing, or I'm going to share a document while you share some of your sentences with me. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes to find a sentence, and then I'm going to ask a couple of you who would like to have your sentence dissected, and I am not an expert in this at all. I'm an expert, I guess, in teaching this content to students to a certain extent, but I get flummoxed just like all of us do on certain sentences with strange sentence structure. So just pick out a sentence that would be a good sentence to illustrate this idea of a simple sentence. I'm going to keep that up for a moment so you have it to look at, and then I'm going to look for a document that I want to share. Okay, thank you all. I've just cut and pasted a few of your sentences here. Oh, Melissa, look at you. Melissa color-coded her sentence for us. Nice. And I love that because color coding sentences is a great way to make something that's abstract more visual and concrete. So I'm only allergic to one thing. So I have a linking verb, I am, right? Allergic. And what are you allergic to? You've got a prepositional phrase, to one thing, describing what you're allergic to. I watch harvesting season. So I have a subject, verb, and object. How do I watch it? With delight. So I have a adverbial prepositional phrase. I'm going to talk more about this. So if this isn't, common knowledge for you, no problem. Billy was 17 years old. Another linking verb. We will see. What will we see? The moon, right? What's it doing? Coming up over the lake, right? So we still only we have a simple sentence, even though we have what looks like a verb here. Canada is another linking verb. We had all been bonded. And again, it looks like we have some other verbs here, paying off debts and contracted with local money lenders. It's still a simple sentence with some dependent clauses there. And Andrea, while wandering through a field of tree stumps that was once a healthy forest. Wow, that's an interesting, good sentence, simple sentence with lots of description. So these are great. Thank you so much for sharing these with me, because I want to come back and revisit some of these in a moment. But you did a great job of sharing simple sentences with me, and simple sentence, again, just meaning it has one clause. It certainly does not mean necessarily it's simple, or that it would be an easy sentence for students to understand, because that's far from the truth. We'll come back to that. When we're teaching sentences and we're explicitly teaching the parts of sentences, we teach the concept of a clause, but you noticed in the sentences that you just shared with me, many if not most, did have phrases, right? So what is a phrase? It's a group of words that work together to answer a functional question. If we're going back to my example of the sentence about the sunset, what kind of sentence was it? It was an amazing sunset. That's a noun phrase, right? But we have lots of other kinds of phrases too. And the importance of understanding phrases is because when you start to read words and have students reading those words by phrases, it gives us a sign that they're actually building their grammatical or syntactic awareness. It helps with comprehension. It also helps for students who have working memory difficulties, because if they're reading word by word, it's a heavier lift for them to keep track of all those words. And as it says at the bottom here, our reading instruction has to include both phrase level and sentence level instruction, not just word level instruction, because there are so many students who might be okay decoding words, but their breakdown occurs at the sentence level, as we've been talking about. So we've talked a little bit about the who and the do, the nouns and the verbs. I want now to talk about what we call meaning links. And meaning links can be prepositions, they can be pronouns, or they can be conjunctions. And these are words that connect or link other words. They don't just link words, they link phrases, they link clauses, and those links are critically important to making meaning. Duteron Moran, in an excellent article, which I'll put in the chat, not in the chat, sorry, in your handout folder. I'm making a note here. This article where they talk about these words that they call mortar words, because they're like lexical glue that connect ideas, and they create cohesive ties to build cohesion and coherence in text. So I'm going to take each one in turn. I'm going to start with prepositions. Prepositions are always part of an adverb or adjective phrase. I've got this table organized by form, function, and giving you some examples. But when we think about the form of prepositions, they show relationship in space or position. They can also show relationship in time, and some express both. But their function, which is most important for kids to know, is that they signal the relationship between words, which is nouns to other nouns. And the example of on the beach, where did the dog run? The dog ran. Beach, right? Where, adverbial prepositional phrase, or nouns to verbs as well. In this case, we have an adjectival prepositional phrase because it's going to tell us which dog. It was the dog with the wagging tail. And prepositions are super important because, as I say, they build cohesion, they show relationships, but they can be very tricky for students. And if we think about adverbs in particular, right, the questions where we're going to expand a noun, expand the verb, tell more about the verb. We can ask these three adverbial questions: when, which tells a time or period of time; where, that tells a location; or how, it tells the way in which something is done. We can also add the why question for adverbial phrases and clauses. Those are a little trickier, but certainly why is another adverbial question. But what I want you to pay attention to in this table is that words, adverbs can be singular. They could be singular nouns. Sometimes they have the ly, usually when we're telling how something is done, but they're not always ending in ly. And many adverbs function as part of a phrase or even as part of a clause, right? So after the storm ended is a dependent clause. It's a clause because it has a subject and a predicate, or a noun and a verb, right? So it's really important. You'll see these phrases not all, most begin with a preposition, right? Under, in, around, with. So again, thinking about how these words function as part of a group of words in many cases. And let me show you, you're going to see an activity in your handouts later that references sort of this idea of getting kids to expand or tell more about these action words. But I want to show you a video that will illustrate this. And if you can't see the video, please come off mute and let me know.
Today, and Ms. Kenworthy, you have the papers, maybe you could, we'll put them at the desks in a little bit. We're starting with a bare bone sentence, and we want to make it juicy. So we have, read it for me. That's our bare bone sentence. It has our noun and it has our verb. Oops, I'm gonna go ahead and put my punctuation there. What we have to do, I'm not gonna make you make it the juiciest sentence ever, but let's add a little bit of juice, okay? Let's talk about where, and let's talk about when. Now, when you write your sentence, I want you to put the when first, then I want you to put the comma, then write firemen help people, and then add a where, and then put your punctuation. That's gonna be your setup, okay? Let's talk a little bit about when. When can firemen help people? Yeah.
At all times.
I love that. At all times. That's a great when. Somebody else have another when? Yes.
Like at your house or in like a building.
Oh, you gotta be where? At your all times. I'm gonna put at because that was the preposition that you used. Because these are our prepositional phrases that you guys have been practicing in your word work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you said at all times, you said at your house, which actually tells me where. Who else can tell me another when? Yes. In the morning. Yes, it can be firemen help people in the morning. I'm gonna put up a word here. I want to see if someone could give me a phrase. If I tell you the preposition, during. Yes. So say the whole little thing, start with that. Yeah, right, during a fire. How about this from this picture? Where are they helping them? In a house? What if I said down? Where are they helping them?
Downstairs.
Say it again. Down the ladder. Do firemen help people down the ladder?
Yes.
They do. That tells you where. All right, so now.
So a little bit about those adjectives too, where we can expand, and tell more about the noun or the subject of the sentence. We ask 3 questions: how many, what kind, and which one. And in many cases, adjectives are single words, as you see in these examples, but in some cases, you can see a dozen donuts, right? A phrase with 2 words, and you have the boy next door. Sorry about that. You have the boy next to home plate as part of phrase next to home plate. Prepositional phrase, which boy, and which boy, the boy who lived next door, an adjective clause. So again, I want kids to understand that these words sometimes are part of a phrase or part of a clause. So in addition to making sure we're spending time with explicit instruction in the parts of a sentence, phrases and clauses, and the building blocks or parts of speech, we also want to think about how we're going to make our instruction more concrete, particularly for students who find syntax instruction very abstract. And again, let's go back to the sentence that you just showed me or you wrote for me. And I want you to highlight the phrases in your sentence, the prepositional phrases in particular. And I'm going to go back while you're doing that, and I'm going to look at the sentences that you gave me. So you said with delight, there's a prepositional phrase. To one thing, another prepositional phrase. over the lake, another one. One of the most diverse countries, I believe that would be considered prepositional in the world, another prepositional phrase. So you can see that there are many, many with local money lenders, right? Through a field of tree stumps. And so then the question is, as we get into prepositions and thinking more about them, are these prepositions modifying or telling more about the noun? Or are they telling more about the verb, right? So that's through questioning. For example, let me see a good example here. Let's look at this one. We had all been bonded to Hussein Khan to pay off debts our families had contracted. Who had they contracted with, or how did they contract? With local money lenders. So it's really modifying the verb contracted. And again, I could color code the verbs in the case where I want them to see the relationship between the verb and that prepositional phrase, or I could highlight the nouns. Let's see. This one looks like it's more of a adverbial phrase. It's coming up where, which country. So in this case, one of the most diverse countries where in the world would again be an adverbial phrase. Which country? The most diverse country, it's adjectival phrase. So we're going to continue to explore how to use these sentences from your text, how to unpack them, and in this case, thinking about prepositions. Before I move on, are there any questions about the prepositions? Okay, Andrea asked about the while is an adverb. Yes, it's definitely telling us when. Well, it's answering the question when is while wandering through a. So let's look at this. This is your dependent clause. Your independent clause is a boy wonders how to make the world better. So this is actually, we're going to talk more about this, what we call a complex sentence, because this is actually a subordinate clause or a dependent clause. While wandering through a field. Yes, although, see, this is where I'm not the expert on this. While wandering is obviously the verb, and while wandering, I think you're right, would be an adverb, but I still see this as, I'm going to have to think about that. What's the difference between an adjectival phrase or clause and an appositive? The punctuation, the info is included in the sentence. And a positive is a relative clause, and it usually, it's always an adjectival clause. And I'm going to go back and talk about that. But thank you for bringing up the question about appositives. It's a good one. So we'll come back to that. Any other questions? Aaron asked, why isn't the whole phrase after Hussein Khan the prepositional phrase? Let's go back to that sentence. We had all been bonded to Hussein Khan. Why? To pay off debts our family had contracted with local money lenders. I think that to pay off debts, to pay off is your verb. Pay off is certainly a verb too, but I don't think that this would be considered a preposition. Prepositions are followed by nouns, although you have your debts. Again, these are tricky questions, and I guess in thinking about these complex sentences that you're pulling out of your text, What I want you to think about is, what do you want your students to understand about these sentences? Like, what's tricky about many sentences is that they're long, and I'm going to show more about that in a moment, especially tomorrow when we dig into sentences. But you really want to think about, what's the bottom line that you need your students to understand, and how can you simplify this as much as possible? In other words, I'm not going to get hung up on the terminology too much. Positives certainly is an important concept, but it's the concept that I want them to understand, and the function of that part of speech or building block. Hopefully that makes sense. But these are all good questions. And I'm going to move on in the interest of time, but I'm going to come back to these sentences because you're asking great questions. And Heidi asked, before I leave this conversation, Heidi asked, do your schools decide which colors to use for building parts of sentence, or each teacher on their own? I think it's each teacher on their own. Many years ago, when I was a teacher, I used the Winston Grammar program with my students. It was very effective, and each part of speech was a different color, and it had the name or the label on the front of the card, and on the back of the card, it said what the function was and gave an example. And we built sentences with those cards, and it was very effective, and the color coding was helpful for some students. But I don't think it matters what color you use. I think it's just a matter, and you'll see, again, a couple of examples later of how I color coded a sentence, just to help sort out all the information that's contained there and make it a little more manageable and concrete. Okay, so let's go back to my PowerPoint. Thank you for looking at your sentences once again. And let me just share this list with you. I will put this in the handout folder as well. This is a list of concrete prepositions and more advanced prepositions that I got from William Van Cleve's book, Writing Matters, which is an excellent resource, and it will be in your big bibliography at the end. I can't talk. This is what happens when you're talking for a couple hours. And just think about these prepositions, because these are really important, but they can be confusing. And a lot of them can be used as other parts of speech too. So that's the other thing, that most of them are simply prepositions, but let's just say this, they can be confusing because of the abstract nature of those. So let me give you a little more information about these prepositions and phrases. I took this simple sentence, and it is a simple sentence, and I highlighted the prepositional phrases, right? And I highlighted them. And again, this is just for you to think about, right? This one sentence has a ton of prepositional phrases in his suite by rough drafts and scribbled notes on yellow legal pads. Children of Birmingham, faces seared where into his memory. So the turquoise represents adverbial phrases, right? Phrases that modify the verb, right? Where was he? Where was Martin Luther King? And where did he see them? Where was he seeing these faces? He was in his suite. How was he surrounded? Right, by drafts and scribble notes. What kind of notes were they? They were notes on yellow legal pads. So now this phrase is telling more about the noun. Likewise, of Birmingham, which children were they? They were the children of Birmingham, right? Relating back here. So again, another adjective phrase. And again, it might be helpful, because they're so pervasive in text, to think about how we can kind of categorize those phrases in a sentence and where the connection is. In terms of teaching prepositions, I'm going to put an activity for you in your handout folder, but these are the steps. We make use of real objects. So when we're teaching kindergarten students, we can take a box and we could put a ball inside the box, next to the box, under the box, etc. We use content-related images. so that the students really can see a picture and see where the chrysalis is forming, for example. And then instructing students to use the prepositions to expand simple sentences. So ultimately, we want to see them using these prepositions, prepositional phrases in their writing. The second meaning link that I want to talk about are pronouns. Pronouns are also elusive, abstract, challenging, especially for our multilingual learners. While on that topic, can you, in the chat box, tell me what language, I know many of your students speak French. Are there other languages that your students come to you speaking? Arabic. Okay, a lot of Arabic, some Portuguese. Okay. Excellent. Chinese. Wow. Okay. So you have a lot of challenges related to multilingual learners, as we do in the United States. Punjabi. Thank you. And the reason I ask that question is because students who speak other languages, and in many cases, the dominant other language in our country is Spanish, have difficulty with pronouns. But we want to think about pronouns, and we're going to come back to pronouns and pronoun reference in another session. But these are meaning links. They help, they're replacing nouns, so they help make a connection between the noun that they're referring to, right? And oftentimes pronoun reference trip kids up because they lose who or what those pronouns are referring back to. Now, just real quick, we're not going to do this whole list, but I want you to see one thing that you could do is you could ask, first I would make sure that you, the teacher, knows the difference between a phrase and a clause. So oftentimes in our workshops, we might ask the teachers to do an activity like this. So they have to identify, is it a phrase or a clause? If it's a clause, we might ask them to identify, is it a dependent or an independent clause? And this is something you could also ask your students to do ultimately, if that's something that you have an expectation that they can identify the difference between the two. And you could further classify a phrase as a noun phrase. For example, we have a noun phrase here, a great swimmer. I'm going to show you the answers here. We have a great swimmer as a noun phrase, right? On top of everything else here, we have, right, a prepositional, it's actually two prepositional phrases on top of everything else. So we can take this activity and divide it up into identification of the difference. Catherine, is it important that they can do this? At what age and why? It is important that they can do this, absolutely, because they really, again, in order for them to understand how sentences work, they have to know the difference between a phrase and a clause. Very important to know the difference. And especially when you're teaching those meaning links and those prepositional phrases and expanding nouns and verbs, the phrases really come into play with that for sure. When do they need to do that is the question. I hope I answered the why, because again, it's really unpacking sentences and showing how they function. And that's why you would want to teach something like this. I would say maybe second, third grade, helping them understand the difference between the two would be helpful, especially because we're going to take all of this information and we're going to bring it into students' writing. And the students' writing is where all of this really, I think, manifests itself as far as giving them the tools to be able to write good sentences, to create sentences that are cohesive, that are variable, etc. Okay, I'm glad that makes sense, Catherine. All right, so if I have upper grade level teachers today, which I know I do, this slide comes from Vicki Weinberg at the Minnesota Department of Ed, and she took our syntax course and she said, oh, this is so helpful. I need to understand how to teach this to my high school teachers. And she created this Jamboard, which I'm going to show you real quick. And there's lots you can do with Jamboard, but I really just wanted to show you how she created this. We know Jamboard is going away in October, but it's a great tool, and you're going to see an example of one of our mentors using Jamboard to teach a sort. But here she's had the students be able to classify from a text that they read a phrase versus a clause, an independent clause versus a dependent clause. And here's something that I think is really important. We're going to talk about conjunctions in a moment, having them classify conjunctions, right, in terms of the function they serve, because conjunctions are equally elusive for many students. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment. So when we are elaborating on the role that clauses play in sentences and explicitly teaching them about clauses, we want them to know the difference between a compound sentence and a complex sentence. And so here we have the example, two independent clauses. We can use a semicolon to join two independent clauses. We don't always have a fanboy. They're usually joined with a fanboy, but they don't have to be. They can, and one of you gave me an example of a nice compound sentence with a semicolon. So now I want you to take a moment and look for a compound sentence in your text and write it down and underline the first clause, the second clause, and circle the coordinating conjunction or semicolon. Do this quickly. I'll just give you a minute so that we can continue to get through this background on syntax and syntactic knowledge. And I also want to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions. And if somebody wants to put one of these sentences into the chat, I would love that too. I'm going to add it to my list of sentences. Thank you, Jenny, for telling me about the adverbial clauses showing up in third grade. That's what I expected. And I'm going to look at this Susan Dutro. Thank you, Heidi. I always learn so much from my participants. Not letting me cut and paste this time. Let's try this again. Oh, that one does. All right, so thank you very much. You did a great job. Yes, you did a really nice job of finding these sentences. And again, why are we doing this? We're doing this to just make sure we're comfortable with this terminology, these concepts, but also I want you to be thinking about how you're going to be teaching some of this to your students. So a couple of sentences, my Amma never ages and her eyes are just like May May's. I'm assuming that's how you say that. You can see my screen, I hope. My words, can you see my sentences? I'm assuming the answer is yes. Yes, thank you, Tanya. Okay, so he was wearing a new navy blue coat, a new brown trilby hat, and a new brown suit. And then here is when your next clause comes in. And he was feeling fine. You'll feel proud and your parents will feel proud. There's your coordinating conjunction. In this case, you actually have a complex sentence because you have, if you stop there, that would be your compound sentence, but this is a compound complex because you added a subordinating conjunction because. We'll talk more about that later. Okay, that should be a different color. Finally, the big day came. Penelope Rex was surprised and so here's your coordinating conjunction. Oops, should be turquoise. Okay, you get the idea. All right, so thank you for sharing your sentences with me. Did anybody have a different coordinating conjunction? Let me see. Okay, good. We've got Jill's sentence, an astronaut's work is never done, so astronauts do not like to sleep. Beautiful. Oh, this is a nice one. Rebecca got us an interesting one here with a different fanboy, right? But commonly used fanboy. In winter, all we can see is how lifeless the frozen ground is, but, right, beneath the surface, there are always tiny seeds of hope getting ready to spring to life and change everything. It's a nice compound sentence with a bunch of wonderful prepositional phrases. Thank you for sharing that we might want to come back to. Any questions before we move along? Oh, we got another one with but. Thank you, Jacqueline. Lovely. All right, moving right along. So now we want to talk about dependent clauses because these can be tricky, right? Let's see. Before I do that, what do we have here? A clause. Sure, Aaron. A clause is a group of words, right, that have a subject and a predicate. Okay. So that's the prerequisite for a clause. If it's an independent clause, it is a sentence. It can stand alone. If it's a dependent clause, it usually has a subordinating conjunction at the beginning. Okay. So if you notice here, I define a dependent clause as a subordinate clause because it's subordinate to the independent clause. It's under it, right? You got to have the independent clause, then the dependent clause will tell more and depends on that independent clause. It includes a subordinating conjunction or relative pronoun, a subject and a predicate. So it all has to have a subject and predicate. In addition to that, it will have usually either a subordinating conjunction or what we call a relative pronoun. And don't get too hung up. I'm going to explain both in a moment. It doesn't express a complete thought by virtue of the fact that it begins with a subordinating conjunction or relative pronoun. It cannot stand alone. For example, because I said so is not a complete thought, right? It has a subject, I said so, right? Predicate, but it begins with a subordinating conjunction. A relative clause is a dependent clause that follows a noun. So the woman who won the gold medal swam backstroke. So I have the woman swam backstroke, right? That's your complete subject, or sorry, your complete sentence, subject, predicate. But I also embedded and this is very common, which is why I want you all to understand the relative clause. You're not going to specifically teach that probably till 3rd or 4th grade, but these sentences are in all texts. In your read alouds that you're reading to your 2nd, 1st kindergartners, they need to understand that that relative clause is going to tell more about this woman. And they can be tricky because they interrupt, right? There's a gap between the subject and the predicate. So a lot of times they'll take this medal as swimming backstroke. They get confused when there's something in between. So I'll talk more about those relative clauses, but they're very, very common in our texts. And here's a list of subordinating conjunctions. This is not an exhaustive list, but this is what I like about this list. It also has our fanboys at the top. But what I like about this list is that it's categorized by function. So how do these adverb clauses, because these are all going to start an adverb clause after I go to school, as soon as I brush my teeth, whenever I walk into a store, like these are all going to start my dependent clauses, my subordinating clauses. They do not stand alone. Now, what you'll notice is if you took that subordinating conjunction off the clause, then you have an independent clause. But those prepositions that you see here, those, in this case, these conjunctions, are really, really important for showing the relationship. And again, conjunctions are one of those 3 meaning links, right? Prepositions, pronouns, and conjunctions, 3 meaning links that are extremely important in text. And yet, the reason I asked about your MLLs, your multilingual learners, is they get hung up on these meaning links because they're very abstract. It's very hard to show meaning with them. So categorizing them for older students, having kids sort the conjunctions that are going to talk about time, are going to talk about place, are going to talk about manner. This is a higher level for your 4th through 6th grade kids, but something that I think is really important for them to understand. So what is a complex sentence? It's a sentence that has an independent and a dependent clause, right? It could have more than one of each. It could have 2 and 2. It could have 3 and 1. Long sentences sometimes have more than one independent clause and more than one dependent clause. Okay, again, making those sentences challenging for lots of reasons, some of which we've already talked about. So sometimes the independent clause comes first. You must clean up your room because I said so, right? And actually, I should have a comma here. Right? Because usually, almost always, there is a comma between the independent and the dependent clause. Actually, that's not true. There often is, but not always. With a dependent clause coming first, you should always have a comma here. So, although I said so, Anthony didn't clean up his room. Okay, and dependent clauses coming first sometimes can be harder for kids to understand. Sometimes you can change and flip it. So I could say, because I said so, comma, you must clean up your room. Anthony didn't clean up his room, comma, although I said so. But sometimes you have to change the conjunction. And I can show you more about that later. All right, I want you to find a complex sentence in your text and write it down. I want you to differentiate between the independent clause and the dependent clause, and I circle or whatever you want to do to show the subordinating conjunction. And I'm not going to see that when you put those sentences into the chat box, but you'll know which one is the subordinating conjunction. And look for something interesting. Look for a different, especially if you teach older students, look for a less frequently used subordinating conjunction, like in order that, or even though, or as though, okay, just to mix it up a little bit. So I'll give you a minute to look for a sentence. And then I'm going to write some of those sentences down. And by the way, you can do this, what I'm doing now with your students in a class. If you have a projector, you can have them give you some sentences and put them up on a board and dissect them with the students and help them, kind of see whatever it is you're trying to teach them. All right, let me see what I've got coming from you. All right, you guys did a great job once again. Thank you, thank you. I've got some good examples to share with you. So I have because when she looks at me and that, I'm not sure how to pronounce this. My way, I feel like I can fly. So you have your independent clause here, right? And you have your dependent clause here. And I could color code them. I'm just doing this for sake of whatever. And I'm going to underline oops, what happened? I'm going to underline the subordinating conjunction instead of, I love that, right? So this is the beginning of your dependent clause. Here's your independent clause, right? I like this one too, because I have a relative clause, which is my relative clause. It's still considered, my relative pronoun, which still considered a subordinating, it's a relative pronoun, but it's a subordinate phrase, right? That tells more about, it's telling more, the First Nation blames the pollution on the operations of Ineos styrolution, if that's INEOS styrolution, and this is what produces chemicals. So again, a relative pronoun beginning a clause, a dependent clause that tells more about the noun. Does that make sense? So the subordinating conjunctions using a subordinate, the subordinate clauses that begin with subordinate conjunction are telling more about the verb. So they're adverbial clauses. The relative pronouns beginning another type of dependent clause tell more about the nouns. I hope that's clear. Okay, excellent. These are all wonderful, wonderful sentences. I'm going to cut and paste a couple more because I might come back to these tomorrow when we do some more analysis of complex sentences. Thank you for sharing them with me. So we're at 10:35, so I'm going to keep moving along so I can get to the end of this unless you have a burning question that you need me to answer. Aaron, do complex sentences always have a subordinating conjunction? They always have a dependent clause, okay? They may not have a subordinating conjunction, as I mentioned in this example. Let's go back here. Where is it? Okay, in this example where we had the relative pronoun which, right? Which produces chemicals. That's not a subordinating conjunction, but it is a relative pronoun that begins a different type of dependent clause. Don't get too hung up on the terminology. Like I said, mostly what you want the kids to know is it's dependent. It has to have something else in the sentence, right? Because it's showing a relationship. I hope that helps explain. It's the function. Keep going back to that concept. It's the function that we want our students, even our middle and high school students, to understand. The function of these words and these phrases and these clauses. The article I mentioned earlier by Shanahan et al. Had this example in it. I thought it was really interesting. Take a look at this sentence for a second. Okay, so this is a compound complex sentence, meaning it has an independent clause, right? Two independent clauses and some dependent clauses. In fact, several of those, which makes it challenging. And the question that they ask in this article that they read is, what happened just before the mother threw her phone? Right? What happened is father gave her a snowblower for their anniversary, which didn't fly, wasn't what she was expecting or hoping for. Who burst into tears, right? Obviously, the mom did. But it's got a lot of information in it. And the other thing I would do, well, I'm going to ask you, what would you do maybe before you ask that question? That question is just for the reader to see if you get what's happening in that sentence. But what might the first thing you do if a kid was reading this sentence, what would you ask them to look for first? Excellent, Diane. The subject and the predicate, the who and the do, you got it. You could look at pronouns for sure, Rebecca. Pronouns, like I said, can be tricky. What is the independent clause? Exactly, Paula, because that's your subject and predicate, right? So it's the blower, the snow blower is sitting, right? Is your subject and predicate. Excellent. You got it. Before we, wrap up, or as we're wrapping up, I want to talk about order, because order matters. Pinker, a famous linguist, wrote this quote: beyond understanding the meaning of individual words, it's their order that conveys thought. So we have the same 6 words in this sentence, and you could ask the question of the students, what color was the house at the beginning? In this first case, it was red. In the second case, we don't know what the color was. We ended up painting it red, but it could have been red, it could have been blue, it could have been purple, right? But moving that adjective, right, around and putting it after the noun versus before the noun changed the meaning of the sentence. And so one of the things that we talked about, at the beginning of this session was subject, verb, object. That's what we call canonical order, right? Meaning it's the conventional order. So we could take a simple sentence like the one that you see here that comes out of a middle school text, science text, about the temperatures of the ocean and the fact that we're living in a warming climate around the world, and have the students unpack the sentence by the subject, the predicate, and then the object, and just sorting the whole thing. The hotter temperatures, right, would be the subject phrase or the complete subject. May hurt, right? Many things. Where in the ocean, and we can unpack. And then we also, in this case, have another clause. This is a dependent clause, but we could certainly classify they as the subject, can't live where in hotter temperatures. And I just a quick word about active versus passive voice. We know that active voice tends to be easier, right? Object, verb, subject is less, it's harder for kids to understand the order of when it's using passive voice. And again, particularly our multilingual learners. So we could turn the order around, and that could be an activity, on a pocket chart, have the kids, move the parts of the sentence around. Can we say the book read Maria? Right? If we wanted to change this, Maria read the book. And again, putting it in order that makes sense and helping kids with the passive tense was read. And thinking about some words like finally as an adverb, right? Does the movement of finally change this sentence? No, it can be moved around. Does one way work better than another? Absolutely. I graduated finally doesn't work so well. But these two sentences, it works fine. We have to add a punctuation mark to make it make more sense. But the idea is that word order is going to impact meaning at the phrase level, right, as well as the sentence level. So here's an example of blue sky, where blue is an adjective, sky blue, where it's the noun. So word order impacts meaning, and words can work as different parts of speech, right? Some words can be nouns and verbs. Some words in this case can be a noun and an adjective. Not as common, but certainly happens. So I want to just kind of wrap up our conversation today by talking about this concept of syntactic awareness. And what is this? Why is this so important? So just as we've certainly in our field have talked incessantly to some extent about phonemic awareness, should it be done in the dark or not? Does it need to have letters? Like I think of syntactic awareness similarly, like it is this metalinguistic awareness, meaning I have to think consciously about words and sentences, just like I have to think consciously about sounds in words to be able to take them apart and put them back together. This syntactic awareness is something that is developed as students listen to, speak, read, and write sentences. And I mentioned earlier that some kids have syntactic awareness out the wazoo because they've been read to so much. They have engaged in conversations with their peers and their caregivers and their families. So they have really good syntactic awareness. Even if they have that exposure, that doesn't guarantee that they're going to have good syntactic awareness. And I am going to spend some time in the next couple of days talking about students at risk, especially our kids who have language comprehension difficulties. And how do we find those kids as soon as possible so that we can give them more of this explicit instruction in syntactic awareness? And so the whole premise of teaching this syntactic awareness is that we're developing metacognitive strategies that help them transfer this idea of syntax into their reading and their writing. So we'll spend more time talking about that in the next couple of days, but I'm going to wrap up by sharing some activities with you that you could do with this. And you're going to see this is a word function sort. Again, in your handout folder, you're going to get a copy of the activity that shows and explains how you would do this. This can take on many different, let's say it could look different for different grade levels, right? And sorting is such a great way for kids to think about whether they're second graders or sixth graders, to really help them classify and understand more deeply what how these words and phrases and clauses are working. But this activity shows a word sort for kids in, I would say, probably first grade. And you'll see how Wendy approaches this activity with her students. With a Jamboard, which is going away in October, reminds me all the time.
The word function sort, which can be found in the Literacy How Syntax Handbook. The purpose of this lesson is to have our students think about the job or the function of words in their sentences. Today, we'll be working on the namer and the action and having our students figure out whether the word that we're asking them to read is a noun, a person, place, or thing, or is it an action word, a doing word. I have chosen words out of a decodable text. So that means that this is a stage 1 lesson. The stage 1 lesson simply means that all of the words that I've chosen, I know that my students can sound out. And this would be in preparation for my reading a decodable text with my students. So the primary purpose is to think about the function or the role of these words, but it's also good to have our students read these words again and again before they get into the connected text. It's also good for working on some vocabulary. It will also give them an idea of what the story will be about because of the words that I've chosen. So I will be using a decodable text called The Bad Hiss by Jill Lauren, and is part of her whole phonics decodable text series. So here I have 2 headings here. I have my namer heading, which are my nouns, person, place, or thing. Make sure that you do a nice job of setting your students up for what namer means. You are naming something, so a person, a place, or a thing. If you feel like this label isn't going to be enough information for your students, please do draw a sketch here or use some hand signals or gestures to help your students remember that namer means a person, a place, or a thing. And then our action word is our doing words and our verbs. So I've collected a stack of words here from my decodable text, and I'm ready to go. So I would show the students exactly what I want them to do. They would get this Post-it note. I would show them how I could sound it out, and then read it fast, bag. And then I would have to think about, is that word a person, a place, or a thing, or is it an action? So I would slide this word over here underneath the namer because it is a thing. Here we have the Post-it note sat. Once again, this time after showing them what I mean by this lesson, it might be a we do. So I would have us all sound out this word, sat, read it fast, sat, and then decide where it goes. Is it a person, place, or thing? Is it naming something, or is it an action word? So they would decide that sat is an action word. And then
I'm going to fast forward a little bit here and just show you kind of one other part of this lesson. Okay.
I want to show you what is fairly typical in decodable texts is that many of the words could be multiple meaning words. And in fact, there are several in this story. And one of them is the word rocks. So we would have a student decode the word rocks and decide, are we thinking about rocks as a thing where we would slide it over to the namer? Or somebody might come up with the idea that rocks is an action word. So please do be prepared to add some more sticky notes and to celebrate that our students know that there is more than one meaning for the word rocks. So like grandma rocks my baby brother to sleep every night. Same with the word bug.
Okay, so you get the idea. Just want to keep going. Thank you, Rebecca, for noticing that other words in this very simple decodable text could be considered multiple meaning word. And that's certainly a concept that's really important. And why semantics and syntax are so closely linked. Also wanted to show for teachers of very young students, sometimes we just do this kind of word function sort with pictures, right? Namers are people, place, things, or, you know, and an action word or a verb is an action. The do is an action word. And we have the kids sort them, and then we have them put the words together, right? And this is an oral like activity. The duck swims, right? And then getting them to, you know, orally produce before they actually produce the sentences in writing. So sort of recapping for today, our whole approach to teaching syntax is this idea that it's a function-based approach, right? That is really the most important thing I want to convey today. I'm trying to get rid of my chat box so I can see the slide. Not easy to do. Hold on, sorry. There we go. Here we go. So at the heart of this approach is this idea that words and phrases and clauses, right, convey meaning as chunks, right? So the simple sentence, birds fly, that I showed you earlier, could be expanded to nocturnal birds of all types fly throughout the night, and the questions I might ask to get the students to understand and to really dig into the lengthier sentence is what kind of birds. They're nocturnal birds, which ones, the ones of all types, and when do they fly throughout the night? So asking these questions, and the article that you had hopefully what had sent to you, and if you didn't have a chance to read it, I recommend that you do, by Nancy Eberhardt, has sentences as the one that you see here that begin with the what is doing and what does it do. So getting that kernel sentence that vapor condenses, but how does it condense? Where does it condense? What kind of vapor is it? Which vapor, right? So these sentence expansion questions really can be very good scaffolding for the students who have difficulty understanding a complex sentence. And by complex, I'm talking about a simple sentence that has lots of information contained within it, or any kind of sentence for that matter. And again, you'll find an activity, a sentence building activity that scripts out what that looks like in your handouts that you'll receive later today. And really something I haven't spent a lot of time talking about, but I'm sure it's sort of implied in all the things that we've talked about today, that oral language is at the core of reading and writing. It is absolutely foundational to learning to become a proficient reader and writer. Children come to written language with syntactic knowledge in their oral language, right? They've been listening to people talking since basically in utero. So they're developing this syntactic knowledge, but these tasks that I'm suggesting that we engage in will help develop children's ability to produce, right, orally and eventually in writing, and understand a variety of sentences. And this is obviously applicable for comprehension and writing. And that all students benefit from listening to read alouds with complex sentence. So even your middle school students, right, benefit from being able to just listen and not have to read the text, especially if they struggle with decoding. They're never too old to listen, especially if sentences are long and complex. So this was one more quick little YouTube I wanted to show you. I won't show you the whole thing, but one of our favorite activities is a sentence scramble, right? Where you're going to have the words in a sentence, and you're going to ask the students to find the verb or the action word or the do. And then they're going to find the who or the namer is doing the action. And then you're going to ask a series of questions. And this is what it might look like.
How to make my hand wet?
Oh, for goodness sake. I'm going to talk about students' ability to what I want. Nope. Here's what I want.
I'm going to demonstrate for you today a takeoff on the traditional sentence scramble activity. In this activity, which is guided by the teacher, You are going to demonstrate to your students and reinforce the idea that every word in a sentence has a role or a function. It has a job to do. You can pull a word out of a decodable text, out of authentic literature, either expository or a narrative, or just make up a sentence that you would like to work on with your students. Put each word in the sentence on a sticky note or on an index card or whatever you're using for technology. Make sure there is one word per card. Step number 1, make sure your students can read all of the words on the cards or the sticky notes. So here we have dawn, at, and then lay them out so they can see all the different words that you are going to be in the sentence. Treetops. Make sure they're at the top of your board or your pocket chart or at the top of their desks or the table that you're working on so that the words can be pulled down 1 or 2 or 3.
Trying to get to another section. of
Word
it.
source
So we're looking for the verbs first.
into their empty space. And then we want to ask them, use either the word a or the word the at the beginning of this next 2-word phrase and say, ask them, who soars? Who soars? So they might want to pull down a and hawk. Now have them read a very short sentence that they've built. A hawk soars.
Okay, so you can go back and.
The next thing we want to do.
Sorry, we can go back and watch the rest of that video. But it basically shows how you scaffold taking a sentence that has some prepositional phrases and more information, and then asking these important questions to get them to put the whole sentence together. And kids really love sentence scramble. And you can, like I said, use sentences from their text. The tricky part is finding sentences with one clause, one verb, because if you're going to ask them to find the verb first, and there's more than one verb, that can make it more challenging. Not to say you shouldn't do it. You could pick a sentence that has a couple of different clauses and take one clause at a time. There's lots of different ways you can do that. So just going to wrap up with some funny sentences that hopefully make you laugh. Don't want to be a deteriorating older choir member. If you don't know you have children, you're in trouble. All right. So we have just a couple minutes left for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We have
Margie,
yes.
Margie, we had one really good question much earlier in the session. So
thank you.
You have actually made my job very easy. You've answered most of the questions in the chat, but Tanya asks, how do you assess student knowledge about syntax?
That's a really important question. And of course, I'm going to talk about it. I was going to include that in my final session. But, I guess I will say quickly, it's not easy to assess syntactic knowledge, other than the fact that once you personally, as a teacher, learn more about it, you can listen to your kids, oral language, you can read their writing and kind of see where they're struggling, right? But it takes knowledge to be able to be analytical with with what they're presenting and producing. If you really have a concern, I recommend that you talk to your speech and language pathologist, and I'll share some of the tests that they administer. There's certain subtests on the CASTLE, which is a commonly used assessment, or the SELF, which is another commonly used language assessment. There's also something called sentence repetition, which is also a nice informal way of assessing your students' syntactic knowledge, because in order to repeat a sentence with different phrasal and clausal structures, they have to actually have that syntax in their own oral language. So that's also very diagnostic. But long story short, we don't have good tools. It's not like measuring phonemic awareness and phonics. It's much more complex, but I definitely will be talking about that. So thank you for answering the question, or asking the question. Making a note of that too. Anything else as we come up at the top of the hour? I'm happy to take one more question. I could start with questions tomorrow morning too, if you have a burning question or you think of one overnight or sometime this afternoon. I hope this was helpful. Oh, you know what? We were going to launch a quick poll. Can we do that real quick? And Andrea, your question, but we do have one more poll, or is it two? I can't remember. Yeah, it's one. Between a phrase and a clause. Andrea, I will be sure to present that tomorrow. Okay? So thank you for answering my questions. It looks like the vast majority found this helpful. How to use the information. I certainly understand that if you're learning this for the first time, I'm certainly not expecting you to feel like I'm expert and I can do this. But this is the first step in that process, I hope. Just learning it and then practicing some of the things. The activities will help you. They're very scripted. They should be pretty easy to follow with your students. So, like I said, we'll get that handout populated for you. And I guess on that note, let's see, we still have a few people. Nope, most everybody has answered. So that's awesome. Half of you felt pretty good about being able to teach it. I'm a happy camper if you walk away from this session thinking, oh gosh, I learned enough to be able to try it out with my students. So thank you all very much for participating. I greatly appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 9 o'clock sharp.